Our topic today is textiles in Islamic manuscripts. I'm Sabine Schmidtke from the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, New Jersey, and with me is Karin Scheper from Leiden University Library. Over the past decades, digital collections of texts produced by Muslim authors writing in Arabic during the pre-modern period have mushroomed. Major libraries include Al-Maktaba Al-Shamila, Nur Digital Library, PDF Books Library, Arabic Collections Online, Shia Online Library, and Al-Maktaba Al-Waqfiyya, to name only the most important ones. Moreover, since printing technologies were adopted in the Islamic world at a relatively late stage and slow rate, much of the written cultural production of the Islamic world is until today preserved in manuscript form. And although there has been a steady rise in the publication of manuscript catalogs all over the Islamic world over the past 100 years, much material is still unaccounted for, and discoveries of titles that were believed to be lost or that were entirely unknown regularly occur. In parallel, numerous libraries have started to digitize their collections of Islamic manuscripts, and a fair number among them provide open access to the holdings through institutional digital repositories, in addition to a growing number of online gateways to Islamic manuscripts. At the same time, what is available online, whether published or in manuscript form, is only the tip of the iceberg. Further, while Jan-Just Whitcomb rightly remarks that the Arabic traditional literature is probably the largest body of literature in the world, it should be kept in mind that Arabic is only one of the many Islamic languages. The geographical expansion of the Islamic world over time, reaching from West Africa and Islamic Spain to Central and South and East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Indonesian archipelago, the Volga region and Eastern Europe, and the linguistic variety that this spread implies, gave rise to a highly variegated literary production of enormous dimensions. We do not possess reliable data that would allow us to quantify the overall literary production by Muslim scholars over the past 1,500 years, nor do we have estimates of the total number of preserved manuscripts. However, the following figures, randomly chosen, may provide some idea about the overall scope of the corpus. The Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul, one of the most important libraries in Turkey, though just one among many, holds some 100,000 manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish, and the estimated number of Islamic manuscripts in all Turkish libraries is 300,000. The Union Catalogue of Manuscripts in Iranian Libraries, published in 2011 in 35 volumes, lists some 400,000 manuscripts in Arabic and Persian, not including the holdings of the many uncatalogued private collections in the country. Estimates of the total number of manuscripts in the countless public and private libraries in Yemen, most of which are only partly catalogued, if at all, range from 40,000 to 100,000 codices. Moreover, libraries with significant holdings of Islamic manuscripts are not confined to regions that are or were part of the Islamic world. Instead, they are spread all over the world. Important and substantial collections of Islamic manuscripts can be found across Europe, Russia, North America, and Australia, as well as East Asia. And now over to Karin, who will talk about textiles and manuscripts from the Islamic world.
Our talk is not the result of a specific or ongoing project. It's rather a broad exploration of the topic, which we hope will sketch the context of how textiles were used in Islamic manuscript making. And this certainly cannot be exhaustive, because the Islamic world is so vast and the manuscript tradition covers centuries, as Sabine just explained. We have broken up our presentation in two parts, and the first part will address methods of textile use in bookmaking in general, And then in the second part, we will zoom in on Yemen. This will illustrate what sort of regional differences and circumstances and geographic specific issues can be expected to have influenced the developments, which is something to take into account when studying the materiality of these artifacts. When you are not so familiar with the Islamic bookmaking, then this will give you an overview of the essential components. Textiles are used in the form of thread and in fabrics. So the thread clearly is used for sewing the gatherings and also for the end band making. And in the drawing, you can see how fabric is used in this instance as a spine lining material. And these form the construction of the book. So the chevron pattern is the predominant pattern in the Islamic end band. But on the top row, you can see a variety of patterns which are all skillfully woven. Typical Southeast Asian varieties are very interesting when we are looking at textiles. Here you can see that the leather core is very often replaced with a few strips of cloth. And although these fragments are very small and perhaps not useful to study the textiles themselves, they do display a variety of textiles that were available. Textile spine linings are a central component to the structure. What is interesting here to note is that these textile spine linings were not supposed to be seen. Only through damage it is that we can sometimes have a glimpse of what is there. And in this case, we are looking at several pieces of cloth spread over several centuries. And we can see that very often striped or checkered fabrics were used. And the color deep blue or dark blue combined with a natural thread is very common throughout the centuries. When the damage is more severe, we can actually see the full lining. On the left, there is a plain fabric on a manuscript dating to 1500, and on the right, a more elaborately decorated fabric on a manuscript dating to the beginning of the 20th century. And we will return to that textile later on. On the inner joints, these fabrics used to be covered one way or another. In the case of the manuscript on the left side, you can see a leather doublure which extends across the joint in a small stub. And only because this inner joint is now split, you can see the textile underneath. And again, this is a dark blue striped fabric. The manuscript on the right side shows a block printed textile that is part of a repair of this older manuscript. And we can date it before 1620, when this manuscript was acquired. And here are two more examples of decorated textile spine linings that we can only see because of the damage. The one in the upper left corner is from a Persian-speaking environment and undated. The other is a Turkish manuscript from around 1900. It is good to keep in mind that these textiles were not chosen for their beauty, but for strength. They were functional, but not visible. That is different for doublures. Here we have manuscripts dating to the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th century. And though we can see some local repairs, the blue silk doublures are part of the original bindings. Textile doublures are fairly common in these centuries, though leather doublures were used more often. And to give you an example, on the left, a block stamped leather doublure, which is very interesting in itself because the technique to decorate the leather may derive from the usage of wooden blocks that were used to print fabrics. On the right side, you see a green silk doublure, the other prevalent color. And here you can see that the application of both doublures is similar. The material extends in a stub that crosses the inner joint. It is important to note a variant of that structure that is sometimes found with these green silk doublures. Then the stub is hooked around the outer gatherings and sewn together, so integrated in the structure. This was found on several specimens in the Dar el-Khatib in Cairo, as noticed by Jake Benson and John Mumford, who presented this phenomenon at a conference of the Islamic Manuscript Association. I've also seen a specimen of this structure in the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. And another interesting characteristic worth noticing is that the application of textile doublures differs in a nuanced way from the general application of doublures when leather of paper or paper would be used. You can see that here, where the leather turn-in is damaged, that the fabric was adhered onto the pasteboards prior to making the leather turn-ins. Whereas predominantly, we find that the turn-ins were made first before the doublures would be applied. And the reason for this is clear. This method of working prevents the textile cut edges from fraying. It does, however, also require the bookbinder to work very carefully and neatly so as not to smudge the fabric. It is useful to compare the Islamic textile doublures with other book cultures in the region. In the Ethiopic tradition, the leather turn-ins in general are much wider, and the ones in Syriac and Armenian manuscripts are somewhat in between. But perhaps more noteworthy is that these are all manuscripts with decorative patterns in the fabrics, whereas, as far as I know, the ones from the Islamic world are monochrome colored and mostly blue or green. And these two manuscripts serve to illustrate the continuity of the tradition. The manuscript above is a probably 19th century manuscript from Xinjiang, and the manuscript with the mustard green doublure is in the collection of the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, also from the 19th century, and also in Sino-Arabic script. And these manuscripts show the widespread use of this feature, both in time as well as in distance from its first use in the Middle East. Best known, or perhaps most prominent, is the use of textile as a covering material. Early examples using costly, luxurious silks are well illustrated in the book Turkish Bookbinding in the 15th Century by Julian Rabi and Zeren Tenende. Here too, you can see the continuous use of the technique in this Leiden manuscript in the top left corner. Although the manuscript is older, the colorful striped textile was identified as an Indian cashmere woolen fabric dating to the first half of the 19th century. And as an aside, it is interesting to note that when textiles are used for the outer covering, they usually are mentioned in catalogues. Even the plain green one in this example. But this specific manuscript, dating to 1849, has a block printed textile spine lining that is actually more interesting than the green covering. It is only just visible in the joint. And the foredge flap and envelope flap are lined with fabric as well. But these applications are not noted in the catalogue. And here are two more examples of cloth lining the foredge flaps. This seems a 19th century development, Before then, leather was usually used for this purpose. And cloth does certainly not replace the usage of leather. It seems to be a cheaper but still strong and functional alternative. Yet for textile scholars, it is useful to know that the presence of these fabrics in manuscripts is usually not made available through the catalogues. One more example, a manuscript that is undated, but it has 18th century owner notes. Therefore we know that the binding is not contemporary with it. It must have been repaired or rebound somewhere in the 19th century. The fabric that is used to line the foredge flap would approximately date to 1850 to 1880. And this artifact as a material witness seems to give us slightly conflicting information. A split in the joint allows us to see that the spine lining consists of exactly the same fabric, which of course suggests that this was not a precious material because it was used in a place where you could not see it. Yet when we closely look at the foredge flap, we can see that it consists of two parts. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mark where the overlap exactly sits. But the usage of these two separate pieces surely signals that there was a conscious use of leftovers of a valuable material. We also briefly want to talk about the use of silk for page markers. These threads are knotted to the foredge margins of certain folios to provide a quicker access to specific parts of the texts. The earliest use seems to be the 14th or the 15th century, but with this feature, it's extremely difficult to date the origin, as well as to identify the applicant. Was it the bookbinder? Was it perhaps the owner? Sometimes the page markers are dispersed across the edge randomly, and sometimes they are neatly stepped from head to tail, as with the Bodleian manuscript Marsh 663, which is a 13th century manuscript which contains 22 works by 13 authors on astrology and astronomy, music and medicine. And the page markers mark out the beginning of each of these texts. Again, we see a continuous use of such fixed markers as reading aids in these late manuscripts, where the page markers direct the reader to the position of the illustrations. This is a Shahnameh, not dated, but 19th century, probably from the Indian subcontinent. And it has the page markers attached to each interleaf, which protects the illustrations. And that's another remarkable use of this little feature. The small tassels are silver wrapped and quite typical for the region as such. And then there is this manuscript with page markers from the Escorial, on which Sabine will elaborate.
The eminent status of the written tradition also gave rise from early on to scholarly methods among Muslims that in many ways predate some of the text critical approaches of modern scholarship. The 12th century Shi'i scholar Fadlallah Rawandi of Kashan is a case in point. He played a central role in the transmission of a whole range of works, Shi'i and non-Shi'i, including the Kitab al-Sihah fil-Lugha by the 11th century lexicographer Ismail bin Hamad al-Jawhari, the Hamasa, a work of poetry by the 9th century Abu Tamam, and the Kitab al-Rura by the prominent 11th century Imami scholar al-Sharif al-Murtada. The Kitab al-Rura, or Amali, is a work consisting of some 82 majalis, or sessions. These are concerned with Quran exegesis, hadith, adab and poetry, questions of doctrine and other topics. The book was extremely popular among both Sunnis and Shias from early on and has come down to us in hundreds of copies. Fadlallah Rawandi separated from the author by 3 generations, had studied the work with several of his teachers, Shiis as well as Sunnis, and he played a key role in the later transmission of the book, in that he produced some kind of critical edition for which he consulted all earlier recensions of the book that were accessible to him. We possess today several manuscripts testifying to this outstanding work. The El Escorial manuscript that is seen here on the slide being one of the most important witnesses. On the lower page of the title page, there is an ijaza, or license to transmit, issued by Fadlallah Rawandi for Hussein bin Abi Abdallah ibn Ibrahim al-Khubinjani, that is dated Rajab 568, that is February-March 1173. In the upper margin of the title page, there is another attestation issued by the Codex former owner, Al-Hussein al-Khubinjani, for Al-Muqtada bin al-Ghadi ibn al-Muqtada al-Husseini al-Mar'ashi, who had studied parts of the work with al-Khubinjani, and that is dated Sha'ban 584. Now, according to the colophon, the copy was completed either in 567 or 569 of the Hijra, while the scribe remains unidentified. A second title page, which is here on the right side of the slide, lists the sigla that have been employed by Fadlallah for his apparatus, Sad, Shin, and Jim, representing 3 direct students of Al-Muqtada. Now, in the present context, Textiles in Islamic manuscripts, the El Escorial Codex is remarkable since the beginning of each majlis is marked with a silk ribbon added to the foredge of the codex. Since the codex was produced in all likelihood in Kashan, it would be plausible that the silk also originated here, but this, of course, is for the experts to decide on. And with this, back to Karin.
Lastly, in our overview, we'd like to point out that textiles could also be found in protective enclosures that were made for individual manuscripts. Most obviously in pouches and bags made of fabric, such as the little example in the left bottom corner for a small North African prayer book. But there's also this one ribbon that represents a whole range of ribbons that were used as manuscript release straps inside slipcases, or in the construction of predominantly leather satchels, such as this one from Western Africa, a satchel that was made to protect a loose-leaved manuscript. And this brings us to the second part of our talk, manuscripts from Yemen. Leiden participated in a digitization project which allowed me to examine the Yemeni manuscripts in our collection sequentially, which was instrumental to gain a better understanding of these artifacts. And we'll return to these examples after Sabine has explained the situation in this region.
The common Western perception of Yemen is that of a war-torn country, a failed state, and above all, a country facing one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Beyond the terrible sufferings of the people of Yemen, who are exposed to daily bombings, continuing food scarcity, and declining water resources, the country's rich cultural heritage is severely affected by the war, be it by accident or through targeted destruction. While much of the damage to archaeological sites and architectural heritage has been well documented, this is not the case for the destruction and loss caused to the many private and public libraries throughout the country and their respective holdings. There is no way to determine or quantify what has been destroyed or what has been sold off, more often than not through illicit channels. Let me briefly mention 2 factors which have had a major impact on Yemen throughout its history, namely geography and topography. They also explain the exceptional role of Yemen as a treasure trove for cultural heritage throughout the millennia. Looking at a map of the contemporary Middle East, one might get the impression that Yemen is a remote place of marginal significance. From a more global perspective, however, things look entirely different. Besides its relative vicinity to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, Yemen has throughout its history been closely connected to the northeastern parts of Africa, less than 20 miles across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. In addition, being located on the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, at the meeting point of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, Yemen has always been connected to the larger maritime network of the Indian Ocean. Yemen's peculiar topography resulted in a political and religious diversification throughout most of its history. The country is divided into 4 broad zones. Upper Yemen, that is the northeastern mountainous area, which since the 9th century constituted the stronghold of Zaydi Shiism, Saada being the main center. Lower Yemen covers much of the remainder of the country, including the Central Plateau and the southern mountains. The Tihama Plain on the coast, and it is important to remember that Lower Yemen and the Tihama has been predominantly Sunni Shafi'i. And finally, the eastern region with Hadramaut, which includes large stretches of inhabitable desert. Among those different religious strata, the written heritage of the Zaydis is of particular importance. Let me just point out 2 aspects. The socio-religious and cultural value of the Zaydi literary heritage as preserved in books and libraries of northern Yemen and its people can hardly be overestimated. The principal reason for its importance is the Zaydi notion of the imama, which positions the Zaydis right between the Sunnis and the Twelver-Shiites. Unlike the Sunnis, the Zaydis restricted the privilege to claim the imamat to members of the family of the Prophet. They disagreed, however, with the Twelver-Shiites, who insisted on a hereditary line of imams. Besides being a member of the family of the Prophet, a Zaydi imam needs to excel in a number of aspects. Excellent knowledge in religious matters and the capacity to perform ijtihad, that is independent reasoning in legal matters, held top priority among them. As a result, the Zaydi imams were as a rule not only patrons of culture, but prolific scholars themselves. A significant portion of the Zaydi literary legacy consists of writings of the imams. Books and libraries therefore qualify as the principal identity marker for Zaydis of Yemen, and this also accounts for the millennium of nearly uninterrupted library history in the highlands of Yemen. The significance of books and libraries in Yemen is also the motivation behind the efforts of private Yemeni NGOs and organizations, which work both to make works by Zaydi imams and scholars available through publication and to digitize private collections. The second aspect, which explains the exceptional importance of the written heritage among the Zaydis, concerns the intellectual contents of what is preserved among the Zaydi collections in Yemen. Due to the Zaydi reception of the rational thought of the Mu'tazila, a school of thought that attributed primary importance to reason in matters of doctrine and that thrived under the Buyids who ruled over Iran and Iraq, Yemen is the only location in the Islamic world where a critical mass of primary sources by representatives of this movement has been preserved. The second most important being some of the Geniza collections in St. Petersburg, London, etc., as the Mu'tazila was also widely received by Karaite Jews, though the precise contours of the Karaite corpus slightly differs from what has been preserved among the Zaydis. And with this, back to Karin.
This history and context helps to understand why the appearance of a large part of the Yemeni manuscripts is so different from many other parts of the Islamic world. Part of the manuscripts were bound professionally in traditional leather bindings, and you can see a few examples on the left side. But many manuscripts have a binding that consists of tattered boards and pieces of cloth keeping them together. It is not always clear whether the boards are contemporary to the manuscripts and were repaired later on, or whether we have repurposed boards patched together. We still see a lot of blue and blue striped textiles though. This fabric, lining a text block dated 1938, appears to be a locally made domestic type of textile. The colored threads are woven. The cream-colored decoration appears a type of pulled thread work, which must have taken a substantial amount of time, and therefore it's quite clear that this piece of textile is not your usual bookbinder's professional material, but really a repurposed piece of textile. And then here is a little overview of bindings with very decorative textiles. These are all cylinder print textiles and all dating to the early 20th century. And they provide a second or later binding for the manuscripts that they protect. And they represent a large segment in society that needed low-cost bindings, utilizing whatever materials that were available. A few thoughts then to conclude. This manuscript, dating 1698, could still be kept in its original full leather binding. The colophon does not mention a place, but a few characteristic material features point to Yemen as its origin. The block printed fabric lining visible in the joint could be from India. Now, when we look at the map again, it shows how central Yemen is positioned in the midst of these many waterways. It was a trade hub for centuries, and thus textiles came from various directions, east and west, and then there were those locally made, as, for example, that striped textile lining that we looked at. However, it is also clear that the material information can only be interpreted when we know and understand the context. Fabrics used in the construction were likely widely available, or they were leftovers and cut-offs or reused items and garments, which means the material information cannot be explained unambiguously. Fabrics used for covering were either very luxurious and fashionable, such as the early Ottoman examples, or they were the low budget choices, such as the Yemeni bindings that we have looked at. No doubt the latter were still cherished, but they tell a very different story. And with that, we'd like to thank you for listening, and we look forward to exchange further ideas during the workshop. And of course, we'd like to thank the textile scholars that helped us to understand the textiles that were used.